Hi guys, today I'm going to show you how to edit your portraits in Photoshop like a pro. So let's begin. I begin by duplicating my background layer, Ctrl-J. I rename it Skin Retouch because that's where I'm going to be cleaning up all the blemishes on her skin. I either use the clone stamp tool or the patch tool. In this case, I'll be using the patch tool. So I'll quickly go through all of the blemishes on her skin and remove those. Okay, so now that I'm done with cleaning up the blemishes on the skin, I will create a new layer and I will call this Hair Retouch. And this is where I'm going to clean up all the stray hairs, all the messy hair, and anything that's sticking out and that's out of place. For this particular cleanup, I'm using the spot healing brush. And I will also use the clone tool in this step, as I normally alternate between those two tools in my editing process. So I'm mainly cleaning up the stray hairs and the flyaways. I'm not too concerned about the hair that's on her shoulders. That's going to take too long to clean up. And for the sake of this tutorial, we'll just not worry about it. So now we move on to the next stage of skin retouching. And in my opinion, it's the most important stage. And that is frequency separation. And we are going to do this by creating two brand new layers. We'll rename the top one High Frequency. That's going to be the texture layer. And we'll rename the lower one Low Frequency, and that's going to be our color layer. Now we will group both layers and we will rename this Frequency Separation. Now go to your texture layer and turn that off. Select your low frequency layer, select lasso tool and change the feathering to 20 pixels. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and now increase the slider all the way up to where the skin is smooth enough. 5.5 is perfect, click OK. Now go back to your texture layer and turn that back on and select it. Then go to Image, Apply Image, and on your layer you choose Low Frequency. Blending mode, go to Subtract, Scale at 2, and Offset at 128. All good, press OK. Now change the blending mode to Linear Light. Select the Clone tool, Opacity at 50%, and Flow at 100%. And now start cleaning over the skin. All the areas where make sure that current layer is selected and begin your cleanup. Now that I've completed the step, I'll take a look at the before and after. So that's the before and that's the after. The changes are very subtle, but I like it and I'm very happy with it. I now select the color layer, select the lasso tool and create a selection around a large skin area. Go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and now go up the slider all the way to where the skin is looking nice and smooth. I'll stick to 15. Okay. Yep. Before, after, I'm happy with that. That looks pretty good. Now just continue going through the whole skin. And you can work at a faster pace by using the shortcut Control F, which I like using all the time as it makes my editing workflow much faster. So what this process does is basically smoothing out the color of the skin. What you need to make sure though is that you only go over and select skin areas. Never go over large contrast edges such as eyes, nose and lips. Because if you go over these high contrast edges, what will happen is the color of that edge will actually bleed into the actual tones of the skin. So you want to make sure that you don't get too close to those edges. And another important point to keep in mind is that when you're selecting the nose, make sure that you are decreasing the blur radius, as a high radius will make it look too flat by removing the highlights. So I go back to my filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and reduce the radius. So I'll leave it at that. Okay. Yep, that looks much better. And I'll continue selecting other parts of the skin. Now that this step is complete, let's take a look at the before and after. Yep, that looks pretty good. I'm very happy with it. So now I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to call that paint. And I'm going to use a brush at 15% opacity and flow at 70%. Now I'm going to start to paint over my skin. The point of this step is to basically just blend in all the uneven skin tones to just make it look nice and smooth. And make sure that you're sampling close to the areas that you are going to paint because you want the colors to be consistent. So this step is complete. Let's have a look at the before and after. I think I'm going to reduce the opacity on this. Before, after. Okay. Now I'm going to start working on the hair. I'll go back to my color layer and I'm going to select around the areas that I'd like to smooth out. You don't have to do this step. I don't always do that on all my portraits, but sometimes I like to do it when I feel like the hair is really messy and I just want to give it a tidier and neat look. You can skip that if you like, or you can do it, and obviously you can lower the radius of it if you find that it's too harsh. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm just reducing it. I don't want it to be too blurred out. Yep, okay. Continue doing the rest of it, and it's probably a bit too blurry for my liking. I mean, you can always go back and reduce it. I'll change that. Yeah, bring that down. Yeah, I think that looks better. And the top part again. The side. And before, after. I am now going to add a levels adjustment layer to enhance the contrast of the portrait. Okay, that looks good. I'll now create another adjustment layer, which is a curves layer, and this is going to be for my shadows. I'm going to call that shadows, and I will create another curves layer. This is going to be for my highlights. I will click on the layer mask and invert it by clicking on Control I. Now, choose a white brush, change my opacity and my flow, and start working on the shadows. So the point of this step is basically bringing out the shadows and enhancing them. Okay, so now I go to my highlights layer and I start working on the highlights areas. Now the highlights are complete. I will turn off the layer to see what it looks like, turn off the shadows, the levels, and the frequency separation just to see what it looked like before. And now turn them back on. Now create a stamp visible layer, which is a stack of all the layers below. And I do that by pressing Shift Alt Control E. And I will rename this Liquify. I'll go to File, Liquify. And now I'm going to choose the bloat tool, just to enlarge her eyes a bit. I'll go to the pucker tool and just make her nose a bit smaller, the nostrils, the bridge, the tip of the nose, and just alternate between those two tools. I'll also go to the forward warp tool to create the desired adjustments. Now hit OK, and before, after. Yep, I like that. I'll now create a new layer, rename the eyes as I want to enhance her eyes now. So I'm going to choose a brush on white And I'm just going to work on the highlighted areas in her eyes. And since this is looking too exaggerated, I'm going to change the blending mode. And I'll go down to between soft light and overlay. Yes, overlay. I think I'll go back to soft light. That looks good. I'll create a new selective color adjustment layer, as I want to change the overall tone of her skin and just make it a bit warmer. I'll reduce the opacity to about 50%. I now want to tweak her eye color, and I do that by selecting the elliptical marquee tool to make a selection around her iris. I'm just going to resize that and make it fit. And press OK. Now I'm going to go to hue saturation and just play around with the sliders to see where I like to leave it at. And just brush around the edges. Make sure that the color doesn't bleed over the edges. And then do the same thing with the other eye. I'll rename this layer Iris, and now I want to change the color of her lips. So I'll select the lasso tool, draw a selection around her lips, and adjustment layer, go hue saturation, and I go on red. And I play around with the slider just to see what I like and what I'm happy with. Maybe a bit darker. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I'll probably just work on the blending mode and see what I like. I think that looks nice. Just brush around the lines. Before and after. I think this color looks really nice. Yep, that looks good. Just decrease the opacity and maybe change the hue. Just play around, and yeah, that looks pretty good. Before, after, and now go back to Liquify, as I want to fix this little bump on her finger that I didn't notice before. So just fix that with the forward warp tool. Yep, just push it a bit more and hit OK. Yep, before after, that looks good. And I just want to remove some of the stretching that happened with the Liquify. So I'm just going to remove that. And be careful not to go on the edge, because that would actually completely remove the Liquify effect on her finger. So just in between the areas between her fingers. Yep, that looks good. And now create another adjustment layer for curves. I just want to enhance the contrast of the whole portrait. That looks good. Put it up. Yep. Definitely gives it more dramatic look. So just change blending mode and play with the opacity. And I'm just going to brush around her face, as I don't want the curves effect to be all over her skin, only on certain areas. Make sure you have a white brush on with a low opacity and brush around. I just want the effects to be visible on the edges, as in the hair and her shoulders and fingers, not so much on her face. So I'll rename this layer Contrast, and I'll create a new Curves Adjustment layer to brighten the whites in her eyes. Now select the mask in the layer and Ctrl I to invert it, and rename the layer Eyes Whitening. Now select the brush. My opacity is already set at 20% and flow at 70%, and start brushing with a white brush over the whites, just to brighten them a bit. Also inside her iris, on the highlighted areas, to bring out the highlights. That's what it looks like without it. It's not too extreme, it's subtle, but I'm going to reduce the opacity as I don't want it to be too prominent. I feel that her skin is too reddish and I want to change the color, so I will create a new curves layer. I'll choose the blue panel and I'm going to decrease the redness and just make it a bit yellowish. And I will change the blending mode, multiply, and bring the opacity down. Okay, that works nicely. So I'm happy with how the image turned out. I won't add any more adjustments to it. It's now time to create a merged stamp visible layer. Rename it Sharpen, as that's where we're going to sharpen the image. Now filter, other, high pass, move the slider down and go slowly up. That looks good. Change the blending mode to overlay. Get close just to see how sharp it is. Move down with the opacity and adjust it as you like. I think I'm happy with 50%. That looks good. I don't like it to be too sharp, otherwise it will look too overdone. I'll just change the blending mode to soft light. I feel that it looks better, and just adjust the opacity once more, and the image is looking pretty good. I'm liking it. So here's the before and here's the after. Before, after. So this concludes my tutorial. I really hope you guys have enjoyed watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so. See you next time.